Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Heroes in a half shell. Turtle power.
Hey Turtle Collectors, today we are going to talk about sculpting. Last month I did a section on molding the sculpt, so this is sort of the process, the step right before that. So we'll get into it a little bit. So unlike what you think, a sculpt isn't just a one-off thing like you would think of an artist carving something out of marble or something like that. There's several steps through the process for toy sculpting. The first one is a clay. So they actually start generally, and you can see this is a really brown. Generally start with clay. This is just the kind of clay you'd use in grade school art class or whatever. You can see these pins in here. That's called an armature. This is pretty good. You can see here how it's bent around. A lot of times I've seen these literally paper clips just sort of wired together and formed into the rough shape. So this is just to help the clay hold its shape together as they're sculpting on it. So they would make these armatures, just blob the clay over it, press it down, and then start sculpting it out with some sculpting tools. This generally would just be a really rough shape. You can see this is for Krang, the smaller Krang. You can tell here that's pretty rough. There's not a lot of detail in him, and that's pretty typical of a clay. There are some sculptors that would take clays quite far, like with a lot of detail, and but that wasn't typical. This is more typical. Just as another example of a clay, here is, I'm going to be careful with these. These are fairly fragile. This is the clay for the unproduced war cat. Again, you can see right here some pieces of the armature inside, the little paper clippy type stuff. This one's actually broken. You can see the crack right through the middle, but it stays together because of that armature on the inside. So that was one reason that they did that. So there's the clay. So after the clay, they would cast the clay in one of those molds, which I talked about. Go look at the last video if you want to see more about molding. And they would cast that into a wax. So this would be an example of a wax version of the clay. So this is simply, they take the clay, they mold it, they pour wax into that mold, and now they have a wax copy. So they like to use wax because wax is very easy to sculpt. It's additive and subtractive, so that if they make a mistake, they can melt some new wax on and continue sculpting in that area. So most sculptors sculpted in wax, and as far as I know, all the turtles were sculpted in wax. There were some sculptors back in the day that did different techniques, like out of acetate, but as far as I'm aware, the turtles were all sculpted in wax. So this stage is a like I said, a intermediary wax is what I'd call it, or wax off the clay. So another thing they would do, if they were going to make something that was similar to what they had before, sometimes they would even cast directly off production parts. So here's an example here. So rather than start with a clay, if you already had a production turtle, for example, that was pretty close, why not just start there? Save yourselves all the trouble of messing around with the clay. And the reason I know this is a wax off the production part is because, I don't know if you can see in the video there, but there are actually very tiny dates on the bottom of this. So this piece was clearly cast off of a production toy. And what the sculptor would have done then is then clean this up, add wax to it, make changes, and he's got a pretty big head start on making a new turtle by casting these off the clays. Sometimes the sculptors would also take previous hard copies they had or molds off the hard copies, shoot them in wax, and start from there as well. So not every toy would have a clay. If they had a starting point that was fairly close, it was much faster to just start there rather than to start from scratch with the clay. So that's two ways you would see what's called wax castings, is generally what these are. Now technically all final sculpts are wax castings because they cast them into a mold at some point in time, but the distinction is that the final sculpt is taken all the way to the end, where the wax castings generally are not. Sometimes as well they would make wax castings off the final hard copy mold. So they would finish the sculpt completely and then mold it and make the hard copies, the final hard copies, and then occasionally somebody would make a wax casting of that. Sometimes just for a copy or a backup, or occasionally they'd have to make changes, and so they'd make a wax cast. And so then in those situations, you sometimes might even have two original sculpts, one with slightly different details that looks exactly like production, and one slightly earlier one that had these last minute changes. So finally here here's an original sculpt. This is for the Krang android body. This is the original piece that every single one came off of. You can see these are made much like hard copies. They come apart. I gotta be very careful here because I don't want to drop any of these parts on the floor. Unlike hard copies, these are very fragile. You can see the pins. So these are pretty much exactly like the hard copies are made. They come apart. They generally have, you can see the disc in there. See that little plastic part in there? Those would be embedded in there to help hold and keep the pins all straight. So I'll just hold this up here. You can see, pretty awesome sculpt. Pretty cool to have the original piece that all were made off of. And as I'm doing this, I'm losing him a little bit. I'm going to set him down, make sure I don't drop anything. And finally, I've got one other final sculpt to show you. This one even falls apart even more, so I got to be super careful. This is the final sculpt for Hose 'em Down Dawn. I'm going to hold the legs here because they fall off really easy. I don't want to drop them, but this is the final sculpt for Hose 'em Down Dawn. So you can see this one has had some damage over the years. This was literally in a box in an attic above a garage where we found this, and it had needed a couple of little bit of repairs, which are done. Generally, super glue holds can repair these things pretty easily if they break, or if you got a sculptor handy, they know how to melt the wax and put it back together. So again, like I said, these are all pinned. Oops, the pin fell out, so I'm just going to set his head down. You know, the arms are pinned just like a hard copy. So just pretty much just like the final toy. It has all the joints in it. So I'll just let you guys see this real quick. Here's the back of him. A lot of times you can see details in these sculpts that just get so washed out in the final production toy, because every time you make a copy, you lose detail. So from here, you remember you'd make, the next copy would be in the mold. The next copy would be the hard copy poured off the mold. The next copy would be the steel tooling, and the final copy would be the production tool. So your, let's see, hard copy, or mold, hard copy, tooling, you're 4 generations down from this when you get a production part out. So that's why you lose a lot of detail. So that's sculpting. I will say one other thing, that, you know, some of the tools they use a lot of typical tools you think, like little scalpels, little picks. There's also a tool called a waxer, which is a little box that heated up, like almost like a pen on a wire to a box, and you'd use that, and you could set the heat level, and you could put different tips on that thing and it would heat that up, and that'd allow you to really easily refine the wax, because the heat on the tip would really let you sculpt really easily. So that's a tool they used a lot, was this tool called a waxer. I used to have one, but I don't have it anymore, or I'd show you. But if you want to see a picture of one, my book will be coming out real soon here, and there's definitely a picture of a waxer in there and some of the tools that sculptors would use. So hope you enjoyed that, and definitely check out my book, radplastic.com. It'll be out here in December of 2020. So hope everybody enjoys it, and if you got any questions, feel free to contact me, Facebook, and keep collecting, keep learning. Bye.
Teenage Mutant